to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's my privilege to have as my guest Lisa Colón Delay. Lisa is the author of the recently released The Wild Land Within, Cultivating Wholeness Through Spiritual Practice. This is a great book that introduces the process and the possibilities of a deep dive spirituality. Lisa is a teacher, spiritual director, and she's also the host of Spark My Muse, a top-rated religion and spirituality podcast. She has an MA in spiritual formation, and she hails originally from Puerto Rico. She's also taught in many settings, from graduate schools to workshops, and her work has appeared in several anthologies and in dozens of places in print and online. She also offers spiritual companioning and retreats. Lisa lives with her family outside of Philadelphia. I hope that you enjoy this rich conversation as much as I did. Welcome to the show, Lisa. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, can you share a little bit of background on your own spiritual journey that led you to the present, where you have a podcast, you're spiritual director, you do some teaching, and you're the author of a really great book, The Wild Land Within, Cultivating Wholeness Through Spiritual Practice. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've always been, in a sense, a kind of cradle Christian, because I didn't have a choice in the matter. My parents met at what was called Baptist Bible Seminary in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. They met there, and my mom wanted to be a pastor's wife. My dad wanted to be a pastor. And they moved to open up a church and do missionary work in Puerto Rico, where I was born. And my dad was Puerto Rican. And so I always remember praying to Jesus, loving Jesus. You know, it was just part of our lives. And it was a very legalistic kind of upbringing. So I had to do lots of deconstructing over the years. Is God like an angry policeman, or, a wrathful father, or are Jesus and God the same? I had to wind up doing a lot of deconstructing, going to seminary on my own, I think, thinking I was going for more education toward Christian writing, and really dealing with actual wounds there, and image of God, misconceptions, things like that. I've done all kinds of different sorts of ministry. Prison ministry really gave me a sense of what other brothers, in this case, brothers at the federal penitentiary level, people of color who aren't really included in sometimes in an education process in Western American Christianity. Their voices aren't heard. We don't read their books necessarily, things like that. And it doesn't seem to apply to them sometimes, some of these white-centered Christian teachings and things like that. So all these things have been kind of working their way in and out, and I've been blogging since 2005. Probably it was about 2009 that I started thinking about how I would write towards spiritual formation, and essentially, how do we imitate Jesus, become like Jesus? So this book is actually quite a long time coming, and it's changed a little through the years, some of the focal points and things that I've learned, especially when it relates to early Christians, Eastern Christians, and the desert spirituality of the Abbas and the Ammas.
You brought just an array of real wisdom and different sources, so I can actually see that it's taken you a while, because you bring a lot of conversations partners together in this book, and even the exercises at the end, you can just see that this has been kind of tested and such. But I love how you start off, you use the metaphor of flyover country, like we're flying across the United States, and use that for spiritual formation. And you also, and then again, you had me like it was almost one of the very first pages, because you bring up the Johari window, and I'm a coach, and we use that for both secular and Christian stuff, and I love that, and I use it. I find it really helpful for pastors. And so could you talk a little bit about the Johari window, and also your metaphor of flyover country for how it relates to spiritual formation? Yeah, for those on YouTube, there it was. You can see
this is the Johari window if you're watching my video, and if you're just listening, you could always tune into the video. But if you can picture a window with cut into 4 pieces, this is a heuristic for just understanding how our interior world can work. It's not there's no magic to it, or it's just one helpful tool to maybe see what are we working with, what are we dealing with here. And it was Joseph Luft and Harrington Ingram. There were psychologists in the 50s who came up with this idea of, for doing inner work, what are we talking about? And so if you can imagine these four squares, there's the section of us, the part of us that is known to us and known to others. And then there's the part of us that is a blind spot. We don't see it, but other people do. Like this, if you have a bad temper and you didn't realize it because that's your family of origin stuff, and then you run across all these people who are having a problem with how you're reacting, that's a blind spot until you know otherwise, and it moves into a different quadrant. And the quadrant called facade is really fascinating too, because some of it is healthy facade in terms of as someone who has issue with oversharing might need to get their facade quadrant in check. But a lot of us, and I would say everyone in some manner, presents a version of themselves that they think will be pleasing or approved by others, whether you want to seem smart or kind or hip or something, wealthy maybe. We all have these little facades that we put up. We know better, but the people on the outside might not. If they do know better, then that would be the blind spot quadrant. And then the fourth and last quadrant is just the complete unknown. We don't know about it, and no one else does either. And this can happen when we have wounded areas in our lives. We may or may not know about them. Sometimes it's pretty obvious. Other times we've never encountered something that challenged those places in us.
Now that's I think that tool is so helpful. So
Yeah.
folks could look it up. And Joe and Harry made
Yeah.
a tool. So it sounds real mysterious, but if you don't know what it is, you can look up JOHARI on Google, and you can just see various things. But Lisa does a really cool thing with this and makes it for spiritual formation, and it is super helpful. I'm just curious, and I don't want to get us sidetracked, but when I think about the Johara window, and I've never been officially trained, I've just played around with it and done different stuff with it. That little mystery quadrant that you're talking about, where a lot of time we have our pain, and that's clearly part of it. I've often wondered, in your mind, if you're fully formed, and again, it's always a process. I mean, ideally, the window known to self, knows to others, would expand and potentially make smaller our blind spots, hopefully, if we're growing in grace. And also I think you're calling it the facade quadrant. That's the one that's kind of our hidden, our intentional things that we hide about ourselves down the other window. So those should probably both get smaller as we become fully integrated. I've often wondered if that mystery quadrant, I mean, the wounded stuff, that could get smaller, but I've often wondered if the mystery was just sometimes when we are blind, our world, we think we can see the whole world, but we really just have a really small version. So I've often wondered if that ideally the Johara window goes two-dimensional, in the sense that the known to self, known to others gets really big, but then that mystery thing gets gigantic because it opens us up to more of deeper truths about God. And again, maybe no one's ever asked you that, but I've just kind of pondered that myself as kind of a goal of like sanctification and stuff.
Right. Well, that sounds right on to me. I mean, again, it's a heuristic. It's just a little tool, but I'm wondering, to piggyback on what you're saying, is that we have no idea about ourselves, really. Of course, we have no idea about God, right? And then we don't have any idea about ourselves, and we hardly have any idea about other people.
Right.
But I'm wondering if you have a point that once you do some inner work, we are essentially like universes, right? And can we really know ourselves completely? I don't think so.
Yeah.
But delving in deeper into those, when we know we're delving into this unknown quadrant, we'll feel this stretching experience that people talk about, or a discomfort. If it's too painful of a discomfort, we just back off and go back to facade. But if we have the support, I would say support and community is huge. People you love and trust who have your best interests in mind, as well as you feel courageous through a grace of the Holy Spirit. You can start pushing towards this unknown, and it can get revealed in one of the other places then. Obviously, our blind spot is helped by the same sort of thing. People saying, I love you, but maybe you need to take a look at the relationship with your dad, whatever, whatever it could be. Or and facade is really a lot of times damaged by trust issues, trauma, and betrayal issues. You'll want to be much more private when you've been hurt before. Some of it is a good boundary to have because there's no need to have everyone be your best friend and know all your stuff. That's really saved for a few people. So, and people who have no tact, who say, "Oh, I'm just being honest,"
Yeah.
but they're actually being mean.
Right.
Their facade is kind of ripped off in a way. Their facade is really like, "I'm going to tell you how it is because I'm so tough, I can handle it." But really, they should have some facade of just consideration towards other people. You don't say every single thing that pops in your head, not because you will be inauthentic, but because it's damaging to people if you say whatever pops in your head.
Yeah, that's good. And you do some remarkable things with contrasts between East and Western Christianity. And then you've also brought a lot of like global voice, especially different versions of liberation theology into the spiritual formation realm. So let's start with the contrast that you make between our Western Christianity and then insights that you can get from the East. What challenges does most of us we've drunk off the wells of Western Christianity? What have we missed by not knowing as much about, say, Orthodox Christianity and some of its deeper roots?
That's a wonderful question. And I hope that when people read this, they don't think I'm just busting on Western Christianity or American
No.
Christianity. There's flaws in each way of understanding God in each tradition. There's flaws and problems. But one of the things that has really, really affected Western Christianity, Protestantism and Catholicism both, is that Christianity was co-opted under Constantine as the official religion of the superpower of the world. So as they're taking people over and they're killing them and raping them, they have the cross out there in front because it's sort of a superstitious thing, maybe
Yeah.
God will. And then it became completely co-opted with status, class, wealth, power. And as the Roman Empire is going out, and later the Holy Roman Empire is going out, neither holy nor Roman, but it's going out for conquest in the name of God, as if it's God's will to destroy villages and civilizations and to just take them over, force them to convert, as if that's something Jesus would be interested in.
Yeah.
That Roman conquest, the missionary impulse that we get as a heritage of that, these are all hidden influencers in what we experience today, the shape of Christianity and faith in the West comes from these forebearers. And there's no way to separate that. It's just there. Eastern Christianity, Orthodox Coptic Christianity, doesn't have the same historical influencers. It hasn't been perfect either. They've had trouble with power and things like that, but not quite on the level of conquering the New World or anything like that. And so it's just good to know that the kind of Christianity about in America or Protestantism or whatever, that is just one kind. And there's a lot of other things going on. You can gain so much wisdom from some of these other teachers in the Christian tradition, especially the early desert monastics really made a huge impact on me.
That's good. And yeah, and just to make clear, when you read your book, there is no negativity. To me, it's one of those, it goes back to Johari window. It's a potential blind spot when you just have one tradition and you don't even know what you don't know, essentially, right? But it's not other people, if you could see the bigger thing, they would know some stuff. So yeah, definitely all positive way you portray these things, which brings us to context, which I think is really helpful. You bring in some different voices in the spiritual formation, which is vital in the world that we find ourselves in today. And so why is it important to consider, say, context that we find ourselves in when we do the spiritual formation? And I guess I want to ask it, who are the winners and losers if we just make it a cookie cutter, one size fits all spiritual formation?
I love that question because it gets to the heart of God's own heart, which is to say that God has always, always been for the underdog.
Yeah.
Period. If you look in the Bible, you'll see Ruth, um, a foreigner, widow, no money, no clout whatsoever. And that's part of the ancestry of Jesus, we see these people who are not empowered and have no status, money, or they're not the right color, or they're not the dominant culture, whatever. We see this shown over and over as a picture of God's grace and love for us that is tremendous. Jesus came as an oppressed person of color with no money, with no status. When God shows up as a person, God doesn't show up as a Caesar,
Right.
from Rome, you know. So I think that if we don't see that these other voices are not just part of the story of what God is up to, but the centerpiece of what God is up to, if we don't see that happening and we think we're the center of God's story, we're the chosen people, um, it's incomplete. There's gaps. It's a poor fit. And if you can, I maybe would to put this into kind of a real scenario, imagine that you're going to someplace fancy and you get a cut on your neck, right?
Yeah.
And it's in full view and you're like, I hope I can cover that up with something. So you go to the store to get band-aids, but all the band-aids are for very dark-skinned people.
Oh.
You might think, oh, nobody thought about me when they made these. This world isn't made for me. Uh, how am I going to fit in? I can't. And this is actually what happens. When have you seen dark skinned band-aids? They exist. But the world in the United States isn't made for people that aren't white, essentially, most of the time. It's not
Mm-hmm.
taking them into consideration. It doesn't want to listen to their voices, their opinions, don't put them in leadership, all this stuff that sidelines um, people God loves.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that this is the context for understanding God's heart, but also for growing uh, in an apprenticeship with Jesus.
So, like, what would be some tips then with that streak? 'Cause I mean, a lot of the folks that are listening to this podcast are many of them are pastors,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm guessing the majority are probably, Anglo or white
Mm-hmm.
white persons in the United States. So, what are some ways or practices for people that may be unfamiliar with anything other than what they just know from their own context, that they can reach out to learn from
Mm.
people that are different and practices that are different from how they kind of grew up in the faith? What
Yeah.
tips do you give for folks that are trying to expand their sources for their formation?
Yeah, if people are even willing to do that at all,
Mm.
I'd love to encourage it and rally behind them and say, yes, let's do this. I'd say it's important first to reflect on what you believe and your doctrine in terms of not to focus on the minors, but ask yourself, who does my theology benefit?
Mm.
Who is left out? Is there somebody left out? We should try to realize that if we have like Annie Lamott says, if we have the same, if we think God has the same enemies as us, you can be sure that you're worshiping a false God. You know, a false God. Um, I think
Good.
we have to see who's being left out of this story that we have going, and that realize the dominant group will always be somewhat blind, have
Mm-hmm.
somewhat of a blind spot to what's happening for people who inhabit other bodies that look different ways. And there's not going to be a way that this is going to become life changing for you unless you become close and loving in a mutual relationship, not in just a ministry relationship with people who don't look like you, but actual mutual friendship where you're learning their wisdom and having the humility to realize I do have blind spots. There's no way around it. I've never known life except for in this body. Of course, I have blind spots. Um, and to be curious about other people, read other books, be curious about people who don't look like you, who have written books, have a curiosity and intentionally read books by people who don't look like you and don't have your same aspects. And I'm including disability, LGBT, uh, people from different Christian traditions, people from different parts of the world. It's fascinating once we think broaden that. And it doesn't mean you have to go along and agree with every single thing you read, but it should be interesting to you that people have other ideas and will definitely see God in different ways than you've ever even considered.
No, and I'll just attest that. I mean, almost all the growth in my own life has just been reading things that, at least on the surface, I assume I'm going to disagree with, and then often I'm really just surprised by what I learn, and then and then it's always a give and take conversation. So it's just so. Otherwise, it is. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I get bored if I read stuff that I already know what they're going to say. So I'm always looking for new conversation partners. But I guess that's me as a professor too. But I found that it doesn't actually just expand your faith, expand your understanding of who God is. And I'd like to think it's made me
Mhm.
over the years a slightly better human being than I would have been
Yeah.
otherwise. But I let other people judge on how good of a human being I am, of course. But thank you for that. Now let's just go straight in. Your whole book's about how to grow in grace, and
Mhm.
it's so rich. You bring a lot of classic disciplines in.
Mhm.
Again, can't say enough. I think really one of the better books that I've read in a long time on spiritual formation. But
Mhm.
what is it in our inner life? And I think this is what you do really well, because you kind of diagnose the problem in several different chapters. But what is it about our inner life that requires such a deep cleansing of God's grace?
Ah,
Beyond just saying we're sinners, of course we know
right,
that, but
right. Yeah, and that becomes that we're sinners becomes pretty obvious pretty quick.
yeah, that's right.
So we know that. I always thought you don't have to tell. There's very few people you have to tell that they're sinful. They totally get it. So well, one of the things that I gained a lot from is learning from Father Thomas Keating. And this wasn't his original idea, but I think he perhaps made it familiar to more people, is that we have each person, when you're just a human mammal in the world, you have three core wounds. Sometimes the wounds are small and sometimes they're huge. And sometimes, they're just pop up from time to time. But because we're vulnerable, fragile, mortal mammals and social ones at that, we will always be suffering to some degree from these core wounds. And not because we're disgusting and repulsive to God, but because that is how God's love is shown and shared through us needing each other so badly. So the three core wounds are safety and security, esteem and affection, and power and control. And you can sense what your deepest wounds are, which one, and you'll have all three, but you can sense your deepest ones by your triggers. For instance, if you feel left out a lot, that's a esteem and affection wound. If you feel afraid in your own body, unsafe in your own body, that's more core. That's a deeper wound. That's safety and security. Some people, and this has been my experience, feel anxious and unsafe in their actual physical body.
Mhm.
And to grow from that, heal from that, you have to really slow things way, way down and ask God to come into those parts. And a lot of these things are healed in community. I'm not a self-help person because I think there's no way we can help ourselves. We can't be alone in this.
Good.
Even God working with us, God has to be seen, I think, through other people. And we experience that kind of love and connection to come into our fullest potential and healing. So those are the first things that I think are important. But also Evagrius teaches us some wonderful things about how our thoughts are not us. And this might sound too simplistic, but if you really think about, you're not your thoughts. Thoughts come and they go, and I describe them as weather. You can have a sunny day that gets overcast, and then it'll be sunny again. Well, you don't have control over those clouds, and you don't have control over the thoughts and feelings that arise, especially because of woundedness. Now, you do have control and agency over if you'll give them attention and time.
Yeah.
And you'll think, oh, if you're thinking lustful thoughts, well, the worst thing you can do is go to some channel that has a lot of things that will arouse that even worse. So obviously you can contribute to that. You can contribute to getting worse. You can let it go and, you know, speak to somebody about what you're going through, read a book, whatever. And so I think that these eight afflicting thoughts, which I mention in the book as weather fronts, um, they're caused by certain inner climates that are sometimes based on experiences and wounds and education and all sorts of other hidden influencers, what we look like to the world and that too. And then these eight afflicting thoughts are really how Evagrius is sort of a meteorologist of internal weather. And he
Yeah.
says, yeah, these thoughts are coming because you're human and you're going to feel anger and you're going to feel acedia and all the rest. But if you are reflecting and noticing it, you can do this metanoia, just turn back again, turn back to God over and over and over. And you can prevent yourself from becoming sinful in those specific ways that are part of your wounding.
Yeah, it's so good. And again, I know you talk about centering prayer in your book, Prayer of Examen, and those are ways that really do kind of let you, well, get the experience that you're not your thoughts, because you can kind of over time, you probably the most startling thing, if anyone, no one's ever done any kind of meditation, is then you get this weird experience. I'm like, I'm seeing myself thinking. So who's actually
Yes.
doing the thinking? And it's such a freeing thing. And I loved your metaphors too. That's one of the things I like about your book. You just like from flyover country to now here's the different types of weather. It's just such really clear, helpful things that you can just grasp, because these are pretty deep concepts that you're really talking about, but you make it really simple. And that's a real gift that I saw in your writing and in your teaching. Talk about fear a little bit. And I wrote a question, like, how do our fears help us grow? I mean, how does fear both, it's an impediment, but it can also be a catalyst for growth if we approach it the right way.
This is really interesting. And as I'm reading Paul Tillich lately,
Oh
I've
yeah.
I've seen even deeper stuff as it relates to and Renee Girard and mimetic desire and things like that. So I would say this is a really interesting thing. And I believe it's Tillich that says we all have, when we have fear, we have an object of our fear. When we have
Mhm.
anxiety, there is no object. It's
Yeah,
general and
yeah,
it's based on chaos or the unknown, or we've seen so much anxiety during this COVID plague. And sometimes the anxiety gets put on an object so that we can actually fear it.
yes,
But of course, as humans, we all have fears. I mean, if you think no fear, you want the bumper sticker that says no fear, you just, that's facade again, or blind spots, because it's just part of the territory of being able to be infected or killed or whatever, be vulnerable in all sorts of emotional ways too. So fear, I think, is something we have to befriend. It's
mhm,
not something we should try to just beat down and fight against and conquer it, or run away or hide or freeze and hope it goes away. I think fear is something we befriend as a very elemental part of ourselves. Be like, it's okay that I'm afraid. If I wasn't afraid, I'd have a serious mental issue. I'd be like a sociopath or something. I mean, that's why people are psychopathic, is because they don't have a fear of consequences or disconnection from others. So fear plays into the very most elemental things of our self. And Jesus tells us to not be afraid. And that's really not because it's sinful, but because it's so distracting.
yes, yeah,
And so what should we do to not be afraid? Well, I think it's important to ask your fear questions, see what those deeper things are. And they often, like I mentioned in the book, they often relate to core wounds.
mhm,
So it could be that you're really fearful, say, to take a new job, or move, or, it could be in a relationship, whatever. But underneath that fear, there's a lot of other stuff going on. And you might wind up thinking, oh, I'm a fearful person. It's like, well, you're having fearful thoughts because you have some woundedness in in your internal world from other things. Don't be ashamed about it. Don't worry about it. Just keep digging. Just keep
yeah,
asking and being curious about your fear. And that's really where the holy work of the Spirit happens. I believe that God gives us the strength and the love. Hopefully, to these practices I mentioned also help in intimacy with God. Um, they're not a whatever. I kind of feel like whatever spiritual practice really works for you is great. For some people, it might be taking a walk or listening to music. For
mhm,
me, it's a whole bunch of different things, but it's especially becoming quiet and just settling in the presence of God on the edge of waiting, really. It's kind of a way to center myself down to the most essential things. So I guess I talk about fear in a few different ways in the book, but I especially hope that people are encouraged to befriend it.
mhm. That's so good. That's such a great, I mean, that's such a great advice. And it's so easy to say that, but it's not the easiest thing to do. And again, one of the
Yes.
things I appreciate about your book is, you emphasize doing it in community. I remember even when we got in touch, you're like, because I had to read your book really fast,
Really
but you
fast.
said it was, but ideally you take a book like this with a couple other people, you read it together, you put the practices in there. So, you really do, like practice what you preach, so to speak. And it's so good. The other thing I really liked, and well, so many things I liked, but one of my favorite books is The Body Keeps the Score. And
Yes,
and it's just funny. I just ran into that book last year, and now everybody seems to have known about it except for me for such a long time. But when I read it, I thought, whoa, this is this little missing piece that I've needed for my own life, because I know that I've carried, I'm not going to pretend like I have trauma like other people, but everybody has different levels of trauma. But I just explained why my body has felt different certain ways. But then you take it another step in the book, and you use the really tragic story of the Tulsa race riots about as an illustration for really like communal trauma.
Yeah.
And so, just speaking of individual or kind of corporate trauma, how does spiritual formation help us to heal trauma? And again, obviously, that could be an hour conversation, but just a couple thoughts on that, if you would, please.
Yeah. Well, there's a book. There's a chapter in the book called Firebugs, and this is where I deal with the most difficult things we encounter, suffering or pain that isn't quickly fixed. And so this could be related to how you present in the world. If you present as a Black woman in the United States of America, you kind of are, people make decisions about you before they even know you at times, right? And so I talk about ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief. And these are things that exist in individuals, but also in communities. And so I wanted to make sure that we realize a lot of times we're suffering together and not totally aware of that. We're not really attending to that. And I think we've really suffered for the fact in really contemporary times of not having real ways to lament and bereave. Those things have gotten shorter and shorter and less significant. We've been more separated from people who pass away. And so we are left with this embodied grief. So grief and all the other things are housed non-lingually in our body. There's a kind of memory. There's a kind of, because we're not just heads walking around. I mean, this is a real Western American concept. I'm like a head just walking around and my body carries me from room to room. But of course, that's not the case. We store trauma in our bodies, and certain communities of people who have been persecuted and damaged and have endured a lot of suffering. And this is one of the reasons why you see certain illnesses crop up that are stress-related illnesses being more so in certain communities. It's not just some genetic thing. It's because there's been communal trauma that's been generational. And when we begin to realize that, we have to realize that healing has to be embodied too. It can't be about believing the right things or praying the right prayers, but that our body has to feel safe again. And we have to acknowledge that our body has suffered, which is much harder because, again, it's not lingual, it's not language based, but most of our life is actually not language based. We just doesn't seem like it because here I am communicating to you in words. But a lot of how we experience the world isn't really based in language and based in this thinking part of our brains.
No, it's good. And that's the place where obviously we need some tremendous healing today that we don't even know. I think this last year has just shown that everybody's just kind of fried out. I mean, I noticed this is completely anecdotal. You've probably seen this too, but in my own coaching work, the folks that I work with who actually embrace kind of deep spiritual formation and contemplative practices, it's not like it made the last year easy, but it seems to have taken a little bit of the edge off. So they've been able to thrive as much as they've been able to because of spiritual formation, because you just seen everything just kind of coming on end, and the trauma of even the quarantine and everything, you just is let everybody get a little bit of taste of what we hold in our bodies. And that's been so interesting. So I'm kind of hoping out of all this stuff, we'll see a revival of deep spiritual formation practices that may spur, a true awesome revival of the Holy
Mm.
Spirit and everything in our world to bring deep transformation, healing, and such. And I
Yeah.
think your book, I think, can be a real catalyst and a vehicle. So again, I want to recommend your book, The Wild, Wild, I'm going to miss it now, The Wild Land Within, sorry.
Sure.
So I want to wrap up with just a couple of shorter questions now, and I
Mhm.
appreciate you, taking the time to be with me today. But what's next for you? I mean, what do you have another books coming? Is there a book you're afraid to write? I mean, what?
When you sent some of those questions earlier, I was like, oh, these are good. These are good questions. Um, well, we talked a little bit about desire. I'm interested in writing about three kinds of desire that we see in the temptations of Jesus, we see in the Lord's Prayer, and some other places that I think if we could understand it a little bit better, it's another kind of spiritual formation, kind of looking deeply and reflecting type of book, probably. But again, I'm not totally sure. I just find this very interesting how we um, don't desire what other people have. We desire, and we find ourselves being made or destroyed based on our interpretations of what people are desiring. It's really, really fascinating to me. And once you kind of learn a little bit about it, you're like, wow, I should dig into that. That sounds great. So it might be something like that. I have some ideas written down. I don't know if that'll actually come to fruition. And if it takes as long to write a next book as it did for the first one, who knows? I'll be in a older folks home or something. But I think maybe that might not be the book I'm afraid to write. The book I'm afraid to write might be about something that's more like memoir and that talks about actual painful, really painful things that happened, but not in a way that's gratuitous, but in a way that is honest. And when I start to delve and reflect into that, I realize just how much more healing I have to do, in an incredible amount, and we were talking about that. The more you know, then the more it opens up this unknown area into this universe you didn't realize. You were hoping it was a solar system, right? But it's
Right, right,
actually
right.
a
That's a
universe.
great illustration too. That's awesome. Yeah.
So I would say that I do have plenty of work to do, and I realize it the most when I think about writing memoir or something in those in that
No,
range.
that's good. That's good. And so can you talk a little bit, and again, you don't have to be too personal on this, but like I always like to ask the folks on the show, like, what is your like rhythm of life, rule of
Mm,
life? What does that kind of look like for you in a given day?
yeah.
Not that people are going to copy you, but just to give some, like to let people see the variety of things that help people grow.
Yeah. Well, I would say that I do have some very regular practices of the Jesus prayer and centering prayer are part of things I do many times a day, because I'm trying to uh, have a diet of not too much media, and trying to kind of curate how I live so that my thoughts don't run wild, because that's what I'm kind of want to do. So I know that I have to kind of limit my media, limit the negative things, because I take them on so profoundly. Um, and they're triggering, and whatever else. So I do find that Lectio Divina is one of the most powerful entry points for learning about prayer with no words, no concepts, and no images. That you begin with the scripture, and then at the end of the fourth movement, and there's some of this on my sparkmymuse.com website if people want to look up Lectio Divina. But you start with scripture in just a little portion, and then you meditate on it, you pray with it, and then in the end you just rest in the presence of God, feeling loved. And it's not like it's going to be this amazing episode every time and you're going to feel so close to God. Sometimes I just feel like my prayers bounce off the ceiling. But
Yeah.
I notice that anything that helps me understand who God really is, who is best seen through Jesus, it helps me heal, helps me grow, it helps me love others more.
So good. So good. Yeah, I just appreciate the honesty there, and even and it is so good. I always love it when people say that you can't expect something awesome to happen every time, because sometimes we give the impression that these are these little magic tricks, but there's no
Right.
manipulation of God and stuff, and it's just it's so good. So again, here's the impossible question. Now you're very well read, so if you're just going to pick a couple books that have really helped
Cool.
you spiritually, other than the Bible, what would a couple of your favorite books that really impacted you be?
Yeah, when I saw this question, Brian, I was like, "Oh, it's like making me pick which child should live," you know.
That's exactly. Oh, jeez.
Oh no. So, my Sophie's choice here. Well, I would say that some of the first writers to get me interested in praying in different ways and understanding God from different vantage points were the Catholic writers Henry Nouwen and Thomas Merton. And Inner Voice of Love is like a journal that Henry Nouwen writes when he's going through horrendous mental breakdown. And the way it's written is very intimate, and I appreciate that. And it kind of broke down some walls, perhaps. And then I probably read Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation 3 or 4 times a year.
It's a
It is
great
like
book.
a just good food. But in terms of some of the most profound, that kind of was those were the entry drugs into this. But
It's good.
the things that have really, I would say that I'd love to mention The Cross and the Lynching Tree by Dr. James Cone,
Yeah.
and With Head and Heart by Dr. Howard Thurman. And those two books altered all my silly little constructs, I would say,
Yeah.
in whiteness, uh, and really made me, it just opened up whole new worlds. And so that's been something then when I started reading some of those Black theologians, and um, Howard Thurman was a mystic, and their perspective, their ideas about um, persisting through suffering, it's so rich. It's so rich. So and of course there's probably 100 books, Brian. It was so unfair. You
No, I
ask
know,
me.
but those are good ones. I mean, there are hundreds of
Yeah,
books. It's like, I
yeah,
have my little library behind me, and I got like thousands of books in my regular office here, and it's like
exactly.
it is really hard to pick. But I mean, these are
Yeah,
great. These are great books, and I appreciate all of I mean, I'm familiar with Cone and Merton's book. I've read some of now ones, but I mean, these are just I mean,
yeah,
Cone and Merton are so awesome, just those two. So thank you for those,
sure.
and we won't hold you. That no other author will hold it against you that you didn't pick them today
I
either,
know.
because
There are really loads of people that I mean, even when you were talking about The Body Keeps the Score, I'm like, not written from a Christian perspective, but boy, so informative to spiritual formation, which is my heart's cry. Like you cannot heal unless you consider those aspects. And I've never been to a doctor that said what's going on in your life right now, or um, what's happened to you, what's your past traumas about, or a Christian counselor who's taken those things into consideration. And I think we have to have more a three-dimensional response to people who are trying to heal.
yeah, it's so good. And the cool thing about that book, if I mean, I'll just put it on the list too, since we've mentioned it a couple of times, is that the plan of helping people actually sounds a lot like spiritual formation. They just don't use that language
Yeah.
because it's secular, it's meditation, and I think yoga and
Mm.
certain therapies. But a lot of those are the same kind of tools that you would use as a spiritual director in a different, slightly different form. Well, last question, if people want to reach out to you, what's the best place to find you? Talk about your podcast a little bit, and let's let folks have a chance to engage with your work outside of your book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Um, you could Google me at Lisa Delay or Lisa Colón Delay. Um, LisaDelay.com is my website, and Spark My Muse is my podcast, which comes out every Wednesday. And I also like writing letters, and I have a PO box is PO Box 146 in Cressona, Pennsylvania 17929. And I think of letter writing as a spiritual practice as well, especially when you think about uh, joining someone on a journey, on a spiritual journey as a companion. It's kind of nice. Now, not everybody likes to write letters, and I get writer's cramp really easily, but that's also a way to contact me. And I love having conversations about the topics in my book that really dig into deeper things and challenge us to be more brave, I guess. And the easy thing sometimes is to just let life pass you by and not really dig too deeply into our wounds. But I think that if we do it together in good faith with each other and in love, there is so much fruit that comes from that.
Well, thank you. That's wonderful. The letter writing, I really like that. So I'll make sure I get that into all those things into the show notes. And
Thank
Lisa, it's
you.
been such a privilege to meet you today. Thank you for writing an absolutely fantastic book, The Wild Land Within: Cultivating Wholeness Through Spiritual Practice, and really appreciate the careful way you've answered the questions I brought to you today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And everyone, thanks for hanging in with us all the way to the end of this episode. And until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be a voice of hope in the world. Amen. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this episode helpful, would you share it with friends or others in your network? And would you consider leaving a review to help other people find this episode? All of the resources are in the show notes, so I invite you to check those out. And I want to also say, if you're interested in learning about centering prayer, my book, Centering Prayer, Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, will be released in September of 2021. You can get it already on Amazon. And if you would like information about centering prayer and some help getting started, you can also sign up for information directly with me. Go to centeringprayerbook.com. All that information is also in the show notes. I will see you next time.